"I don't care who you are," the officer shouted, pulling his gun and aiming it at her chest. "FBI, you're just a puppet in an expensive suit." But within 2 minutes, the officer was on the ground handcuffed, stunned by the realization that he had made a mistake. An FBI agent is not someone you toy with. Never challenge real power. The neighborhood was quiet. Pale golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting streaks of light across the pavement. This stretch of road was almost deserted in the late afternoon. A sleek black car pulled up next to the park's grassy edge, its engine humming softly before shutting off. Behind the wheel sat Jasmine Green, an FBI agent, a woman with a cold, stern appearance. She remained in the car, resting her arm on the window, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings without a hint of urgency. She was someone who never revealed emotion, but no one could deny the strength that radiated from her calmness. Even in a deserted place with nothing notable, every moment for Jasmine had meaning, had purpose. Officer Tom Davis, just beginning his shift, stepped across the grass toward the black luxury vehicle. He was tall, with a smug face, his police cap tilted to the side, and a pistol held firmly in his hand. He had no suspicion about the woman sitting in the car. Police rarely encountered such situations in this quiet area. He stopped at the car door, smirked confidently, and ordered, "License and registration now." Jasmine didn't respond right away. She simply shrugged slightly, exhaled quietly, and slowly rolled down the window. Every movement was calm, unhurried, with nothing to fear. She looked directly at the officer without revealing any emotion. Her eyes showed no fear or hesitation. People like Davis were probably used to dealing with those who panicked when harassed, but Jasmine was not one of them. She understood that, as an FBI agent, maintaining composure was her greatest strength. Davis noticed her calm and couldn't help but scoff. "This is the FBI?" he sneered. "Who do you think you are, showing up here and refusing to hand over your documents?" His words were filled with contempt, as if he were dealing with an ordinary person, someone insignificant. The feeling of power grew inside him, convinced that Jasmine had no way to resist his authority. That sense gave him complete confidence in his control of the situation. Jasmine didn't rush to reply. Instead, she slowly extended her hand out the window, holding up her FBI badge and letting it hover in front of the officer. Her eyes didn't follow the badge, but stayed fixed on Davis, her gaze piercing through every word he had said. Davis was no longer composed. He glanced at the badge, then looked back at Jasmine with a puzzled expression, but there was no respect or fear in his eyes. "FBI? That's funny," Davis mocked. "The FBI isn't what you think can scare me." He spat out his words with contempt, unaware that he was making a serious mistake. Sensing the challenge in the officer's voice, Jasmine kept her cold expression unchanged. She let none of Davis's mockery disturb her composure. In truth, she had no reason to feel concerned, as everything unfolding now was something she had already anticipated. Still, Davis's defiance made the situation more tense. With a tone that was firm yet calm, Jasmine spoke, her voice never rising, but each word carried confidence and authority. "Don't do it, you don't understand." It was not a threat, but a quiet warning, one that made it clear this was not a situation someone could easily dominate. Davis looked at Jasmine, but now his gaze had shifted. A flicker of uncertainty crept in. Still, the arrogance in him hadn't fully faded. He refused to back down, convinced he still had control. Irritated, he raised his gun higher, trying to assert his power. "Show your ID now, or I will handle you." His voice hardened, no longer mocking, now a direct command. Davis believed a little force would make Jasmine submit. He didn't know everything was about to change in an instant, within just a few minutes. Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat firm in the car, her eyes never leaving Davis, as if facing something completely ordinary. A force radiated from her, one Davis couldn't immediately see. He didn't yet understand that, in that moment, Jasmine was not just any woman, but an FBI agent with an invisible power he couldn't control. She was prepared for anything, but she would not let this turn into more than a calculated standoff. Then, as everything seemed to reach a peak, she sat still, calm as ever, letting the officer walk further into his mistake. She calmly held her FBI badge outside the window, her gaze unchanged, not the slightest flicker of hesitation. The badge caught the light through the car window, glinting like a clear statement. Jasmine was not someone to be intimidated. Davis stood frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. The scene in front of him shifted, and he stared at the badge in disbelief, his eyes wide, realizing his mistake far too late. Jasmine didn't need to say anything more. She offered a faint smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet confidence in her authority. No need for forceful action. Jasmine let silence be her strongest weapon. It was a lesson not just for Davis, but for anyone who underestimated power and justice. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to show anger. She only needed to do what was right. Davis now began to feel the tension in his body, but he still couldn't stop. His arrogance was deeply rooted in his mind. A wave of confusion overwhelmed him, but never had he imagined that in just seconds, he would be the one bound by the consequences of his own poor decisions. The undeniable truth now stood right before him, and he still couldn't grasp how Jasmine, the woman in the luxury car, had flipped the situation so effortlessly. And then, in a single moment, all the tension exploded. No gunshot rang out, no violence occurred. Jasmine remained firmly seated in the car, staring directly at the officer, waiting for him to realize his own mistake. Her eyes were a verdict, needing no words. She simply let the officer walk into his own failure, and her silence was the only answer he needed. Officer Davis now stood there, filled with confusion and fear, finally understanding he could not win this confrontation. She calmly held her FBI badge out the window, her eyes steady, unchanged, without the slightest tremor. The badge caught the sunlight through the windshield, gleaming like a clear assertion. Jasmine was not someone to be intimidated. Davis stood there, unable to believe his eyes. The scene before him began to shift, and he stared at the badge, eyes wide, realizing his mistake far too late. Jasmine didn't need to say anything more. She gave a faint smile, not one of triumph, but simply a reflection of her confidence in her own authority. Without any forceful gesture, Jasmine let silence become her strongest tool. It was a lesson not only for Davis, but for anyone who underestimated power and justice. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to show anger. She only needed to do what was right. Davis now began to feel the tension in his body, yet he still couldn't stop. His arrogance had sunk deep into his mind. He felt a confusion he couldn't explain, but he'd never imagined that within seconds, he would be the one trapped by his own poor decisions. The undeniable truth stood right in front of him, and he still couldn't believe that Jasmine, the seemingly ordinary woman in the luxury car, had flipped the situation so effortlessly. And then, in a single moment, all the tension burst. No gunfire, no violence. Jasmine remained seated firmly in the car, her eyes fixed on the officer, waiting for him to recognize his mistake. Her gaze was a verdict, needing no words. She let the officer stumble into his own failure, and her silence was the only response required. Officer Davis now stood there, filled with confusion and fear, finally realizing he could not win this confrontation. Davis stood there, his eyes locked on the FBI badge in Jasmine's hand. The man who had just moments ago been full of arrogance and confidence was now beginning to feel a wave of confusion rushing in. The FBI badge was not just a piece of identification, it was a symbol of power Davis had never imagined he would encounter in his life. His earlier mocking words now echoed like a painful slap, striking directly at his own pride. As he stared at the badge, a delayed awareness surged in his mind. Jasmine was not an ordinary woman. She was an FBI agent, someone who could flip the entire situation with nothing more than a look. "You're FBI?" Davis asked, his voice unsteady, tinged with surprise and a hint of fear he could no longer hide. In that instant, all the bravado within him seemed to dissolve, replaced by growing unease. The sense of control he had clung to was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he had made a serious mistake. But Davis still wasn't ready to admit it. He refused to face the truth that he was wrong. Instead of stopping and reassessing, he tried to cling to control by forcing out words that carried no weight. "You think this badge scares me?" His tone, though aiming for confidence, betrayed a clear weakness. His voice wavered, and the firmness he once projected was giving way to visible uncertainty. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She stared directly into the officer's eyes, her sharp gaze unwavering, unblinking. The words in her mind settled. No need for a strong reaction. She knew well that men like Davis didn't need long lectures. She spoke calmly, her voice steady, each word carrying weight. "You put yourself in this position. Now it's time to face the consequences." Every sentence landed like a blade against Davis's pride, forcing him to confront the reality that not only were his actions exposed, but the price for his abuse of power was closing in. While Davis still hadn't fully accepted this truth, Jasmine did something he never expected. She didn't just sit there and watch. She called for FBI backup. A simple phone call, yet it carried immense weight. She knew that once she took action, the outcome could no longer be changed. The FBI was coming not only to protect her rights, but to prove that justice would always prevail. There was nothing Davis could do to stop it. He tried to stay upright, but deep down, he understood that he could not escape the ending that was rapidly approaching. Davis, in a state of panic, began to make weak defensive moves. He tried to step back, gripping his gun as if it were his only lifeline, but Jasmine remained unshaken. She still held control over the situation. She had already known that when things crossed the line, only decisive and intelligent action would lead to resolution. Jasmine didn't need to use force or weapons. Her calm presence, combined with the true authority of the FBI, was all she required. While Davis continued to resist, he began to realize it was too late. The abusive officer was no longer in control. Jasmine, with the composure and confidence of an FBI agent, quickly implemented the appropriate response. The FBI arrived shortly after. The agents approached the abusive officer without hesitation. Officer Davis offered no resistance as they restrained him, handcuffed him, and escorted him to the police vehicle. Everything happened quickly, but with each movement, Davis felt as if his entire world was collapsing. He didn't just lose his power instantly. He now faced prosecution for his misconduct. Each passing second, Davis struggled to grasp how he had ended up in this situation, but everything had moved too fast. Jasmine didn't need to do much to prevail because Davis had brought this downfall upon himself. From a smug police officer, he had become a disgraced man facing the consequences of racial bias and abuse of authority. Jasmine, calm and sharp, was not only the victor in this confrontation, she became a symbol of justice, of intelligent use of lawful power to stand against abuse. Now, handcuffed and taken away, Davis could only look at Jasmine one last time. His eyes were filled with regret, but also with the silent admission that he had been wrong. A police officer had not only allowed arrogance to guide him, but had let racial prejudice dictate his actions. Now, he had to pay the price for all of it. Jasmine stood still, unhurried, without a single mocking word. She simply looked at Davis, once again affirming that power is never ruled by arrogance and abuse, but always belongs to those who uphold justice with calm and integrity. Officer Davis still had not fully grasped the depth of his mistake, but as the FBI agents approached, he had no choice but to surrender. Jasmine's warnings had now become reality, and he was immediately placed in handcuffs. Although Davis resisted slightly against the undeniable force of the justice system and Jasmine's decisiveness, he had no chance. The officer, once the abuser of authority, was now the restrained one, unable to fight back. Bystanders, who had witnessed the entire event from start to finish, could hardly believe their eyes as they watched a police officer, once believing himself untouchable, now firmly in the custody of the law. Jasmine showed no satisfaction or arrogance. She looked back at Davis one last time, her gaze sharp and unforgiving. She didn't need to express victory, because the moment itself was proof of the strength of justice and lawful authority. Jasmine simply turned away, needing to do nothing more. She knew this officer would face consequences, and those who had witnessed the event would understand that justice would always prevail, without noise, without spectacle. She had done what she needed to do, and now what mattered was what came next. News of the incident spread rapidly like a tidal wave across social media platforms. A video showing Officer Davis pulling a gun on a black woman, then being arrested on the spot, immediately captured public attention. The image of the officer in handcuffs, being led away in helplessness, stood in stark contrast to the authority he once believed he held, becoming a powerful symbol of the fall of those who abuse power. Clips were shared on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and many other platforms. Comments condemning the officer's racism and abuse of power exploded across the internet, and Jasmine's story was no longer just her own. It had become society's story, a testimony to the strength of those who stand up for justice. The story of Davis and Jasmine quickly dominated headlines and television broadcasts. News stations and media outlets began covering the incident nonstop, analyzing every detail, raising urgent questions about how law enforcement agencies monitor police behavior. Experts, commentators, and social activists all began to speak out. Interviews with civil rights groups, legal professionals, and eyewitnesses all emphasized a single, clear message: it is time for change. The video of the officer's arrest became a striking image, forcing the public to confront the fact that society could no longer tolerate acts of racial bias and abuse of authority. Demands for reform and police conduct procedures emerged, and a change in the system was no longer just a request, but an urgent necessity. The community and civil rights organizations immediately spoke out. Civil rights advocates, including groups like the American Civil Liberties Union and Black Lives Matter, not only condemned the officer's actions, but also demanded a complete reform of the police force. Police reform cannot be delayed, they said. The story of Davis and Jasmine, with all its explosive and tense developments, became a symbol in the fight against racial discrimination. These organizations continued to push campaigns, urging authorities to enforce stronger measures to end racism within public institutions. In addition, the story sparked a broader conversation about how police treat citizens, especially people of color. Leaders within the Black community and justice advocacy groups called for radical reform in police practices. They emphasized that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger system in need of change. Meetings and forums were organized to discuss ways law enforcement could improve its service to communities free from discrimination and abuse. The community did not remain passive. It began to act. Civil rights groups and social activists engaged in media discussions, encouraging citizens to raise their voices for justice and their rights. This story created a powerful wave, not only within the country, but around the world. Protests continued in major cities, carrying the slogan, "Justice for All." Organizations and individuals became part of a social movement where power and justice could no longer be distorted by racial bias. Officer Davis faced criticism not only from the public, but also from his own colleagues. Media outlets and opinion pieces continued to condemn his actions. He became a symbol of police abuse and racial discrimination. Public criticism extended beyond condemning him personally, raising questions about how such behavior could persist within the police force. The once arrogant officer was now held accountable for his actions, and no one could shield him from that truth. Now, not only Davis, but the entire policing system was confronted with serious questions about how it operated and its responsibility to the people it served. Further investigations, expanded across police departments, would determine whether similar mistakes could happen again, and whether the system could correct itself to become fairer and more transparent. This story was just one example of abuse of power, but it also became a social reckoning, prompting society to reevaluate the core values of justice and human rights. The official investigation into Officer Davis's conduct was launched swiftly after the intense incident. Supported by civil rights organizations and justice advocates, authorities no longer had time to hesitate. Clear video evidence and the testimony of Jasmine Green, who had witnessed everything, were added to the case file. Every statement, every detail, no matter how small, became sharp evidence against the officer, forcing a thorough examination of all his actions. The footage of Davis drawing his weapon and threatening a woman he had no idea was an FBI agent became a central part of the investigation. His mocking remarks about the FBI badge were not only offensive, but also served as proof of racial bias. an offense that could not be tolerated under any circumstances. As the investigation unfolded, pressure from the community and social organizations intensified. Public demands for Davis to be held accountable grew louder and more forceful. It was no longer just civil rights groups, but ordinary citizens began expressing their outrage. Calls for justice became impossible to ignore, and the fact that Davis had to face consequences became inevitable. He had not only harmed Jasmine as an individual, but he had also damaged an entire community by allowing unchecked racism and abuse of authority. Davis's actions were no longer just his own. They had become a societal issue, forcing people to question the systems and values they once trusted. Throughout the investigation, Davis began to understand that he could not undo what had been done. Despite attempts to justify his behavior, every excuse he gave fell flat. His racial bias had been clearly documented, and the undeniable evidence had been made public. Davis, who once saw himself as holding absolute power in any situation, now realized he was just a pawn in the workings of justice. No matter how hard he tried to deny or downplay the seriousness, he could not escape the reality that his actions had crossed all acceptable boundaries in society. At this point, he was no longer the smug officer, but a man confronting the collapse of everything he believed in about the system he once thought he represented and defended. Public criticism from the community and human rights organizations did not fade. It only grew stronger. Protests erupted across the country, from major cities to lesser-known areas. People stood up, not just for Jasmine, but for a greater cause. They could no longer allow abuse of power and racial discrimination to continue unchecked in society. Organizations such as Black Lives Matter, the American Civil Liberties Union, and citizen rights groups began organizing rallies, calling for reform in policing. Slogans like "Justice for Jasmine" and "End Racial Profiling in Policing" were not just chants. They were genuine calls for systemic change in how law enforcement and justice were carried out. The social community could not remain silent when it became clear that a police officer, entrusted with the power to uphold the law, could so easily misuse that power to harass and threaten civilians. The story of Jasmine and Davis became a symbol of failure within the police system and a driving force for reform. Protests expanded beyond directly affected individuals, spreading through the wider public with strong participation from groups, organizations, and citizens who supported change in the justice system. Justice was no longer just about addressing one incident, but about comprehensive reform in policing to ensure that no one would have to face such abuse again. The effects of the incident began to ripple widely. Though it was just one case, it triggered a powerful wave within the community. Social organizations started to recognize the urgency of standing up against racial bias in all public institutions. Discussions on power, equality, and justice took center stage. Major questions about how police treated citizens, particularly vulnerable groups like people of color, were brought to light and debated across media platforms. This story did not just highlight the problem of racial discrimination in law enforcement. It served as a forceful reminder that justice must always come first. Davis, witnessing the community's response and the outcry from human rights advocates, could not help but feel isolated in his attempt to hold on to what little power he had left. He faced not only public outrage, but also contempt from colleagues and law enforcement agencies. Once a smug officer, he had become a symbol of failure in modern policing. The image of him handcuffed and escorted away stood as undeniable proof of what happens when officers fail to uphold professional ethics and proper conduct. Although Davis was just one individual in a vast system, his actions ignited sweeping reform efforts within the police force. This fight was not just Jasmine's, it was for all who had been marginalized and voiceless in society. While the incident itself was small, it sparked a broader movement challenging how police behaved and served the public. The protests, discussions, and social campaigns all aimed at a single goal: justice must be served, and no abuse of power should go unpunished. Davis, even if he did not not realize it immediately, had become part of history, part of a struggle not just for one person, but for a more just and equal society. The rest of his days would be spent facing serious questions about ethics, power, and responsibility. His actions had not only altered one woman's life, they had changed an entire system, pushing it closer to fairness and human dignity. Immediately after the incident, video footage capturing Officer Davis drawing his weapon and threatening Jasmine Green began spreading at lightning speed. Within minutes, the footage appeared across major social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, drawing the attention of millions. The image of the officer, once believed to be the one in total control, now reduced to the defeated party, handcuffed and escorted away, shocked the public. Especially striking was the image of Jasmine, calm and unshaken, facing the officer without fear. This contrast made the video even more powerful. Each time it was shared, a new wave of outrage erupted, not just against Davis's actions, but against the larger issue of police abuse and racial bias. The public quickly understood this was not just a personal confrontation, but a sign of a deeper problem within society. The online community could not remain silent in the face of such injustice. Comments poured across social media, with thousands speaking out for justice for Jasmine and condemning the officer's conduct. Justice for Jasmine became a rallying cry, repeated in every post, video, and online discussion. Many expressed their anger, insisting that behavior like this could no longer be tolerated in law enforcement. Black advocacy groups such as Black Lives Matter quickly shared the video and issued strong statements about the urgent need for police reform. They condemned Davis's actions, stating that his behavior was not an isolated mistake, but a symptom of a much larger system where racism and unchecked authority had become deeply embedded in police operations. This was no longer about one rogue officer, but about a fight for justice, for those who face racial discrimination, and for a more equitable police force. The public reaction surged with more intensity than ever before. Civil rights groups and advocates for citizens' rights joined the conversation, demanding sweeping reforms in law enforcement. Experts and social activists began speaking out about the dangers of allowing racial bias and abuse of power to persist within policing. The video became undeniable proof that change was necessary. The story drew attention not only from the Black community, but from other communities, civil rights supporters, and justice organizations. These groups understood clearly that Jasmine's story was not just about one individual, but about an entire society where fairness and civil rights were under threat from the very people meant to uphold them. The incident quickly became the center of national conversations about racism and power within the policing system. Media outlets and analysts began asking serious questions about how law enforcement treated citizens, particularly those from minority groups. These discussions went beyond Officer Davis's actions, focusing also on how the police system protected citizens' rights and ensured the absence of discrimination. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis became a symbol of systemic failure to deliver justice equally, especially to people of color. The movement opposing racial discrimination in policing began to spread throughout major cities. Protests continued, with thousands taking to the streets to express outrage over Davis's behavior and demand sweeping changes in law enforcement. Organizations called on local and federal authorities to implement stronger measures to eliminate racial discrimination in all public institutions. They demanded comprehensive reforms in how police officers were recruited, trained, and monitored. The video became a symbol in the fight against abuse and racial bias, making it clear that silence could no longer be an option. Banners reading "Justice for Jasmine" appeared at protests everywhere, reflecting the power of communities to stand up for equality and justice. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis served as the spark for a growing social movement. People from all walks of life began to recognize the importance of justice and the need to defend the rights of those who face discrimination. Organizations like Black Lives Matter and the American Civil Liberties Union continued to push for systemic reform, calling for stronger safeguards to protect civil rights and end racial profiling within the police force. These groups not only led media campaigns, but also engaged directly with authorities. demanding new policies that would ensure policing aligned with principles of fairness and human dignity. Under growing public pressure, the government and law enforcement agencies were forced to confront the need for reform and adjustment. Debates around overhauling policing practices became more urgent than ever. Protests evolved from simple demonstrations into a broader social movement demanding deep change. This was no longer the cause of a single group. It had become a global movement, driving reform in how law enforcement agencies operated around the world. Jasmine's video had become more than a symbol of resistance to racial discrimination. It had become a powerful call for reform in policing. The protests were no longer just against one abusive officer. They were against a system that allowed such behavior to exist. As a result, the story of Jasmine and Officer Davis was not just a fight for individual justice. It was a fight for the justice and rights of an entire society. Shortly after the story of Jasmine and Officer Davis exploded across social media, civil rights organizations became heavily involved in the fight for justice. Prominent groups, such as the American Civil Liberties Union and those supporting the rights of people of color, did not simply speak out. They began organizing meetings, protests, and public actions calling for reform within the policing system. These groups quickly recognized that the incident was not just about one officer's racist behavior, but a broader problem involving the structure and operations of law enforcement. They issued strong criticisms of the racial discrimination present in public institutions and put forward demands for sweeping reform. One of their most urgent demands was the improvement of police training, especially retraining officers on matters of race, power, and how to treat all citizens fairly, regardless of ethnicity or background. These organizations did not wait for another tragic event. They took immediate action by organizing public discussions across media and within communities to confront issues of racism and abuse in policing. Forums and deep discussions on police reform were held regularly. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis was used as a key example of critical failures within law enforcement involving behavior that was unacceptable to both the public and advocacy groups. This incident served as a wake-up call for anyone who believed police officers could act with impunity. These conversations moved beyond Jasmine's personal experience and expanded into major questions about justice and civil rights. The community was now demanding a complete overhaul in how policing functioned, from recruitment and training to monitoring and accountability. The government, recognizing the growing unrest and dissatisfaction in society, began to respond more forcefully. Unable to remain on the sidelines while public pressure and social organizations called for reform, officials launched formal investigations into Officer Davis's actions and other cases of misconduct within the police. Authorities, rather than reacting briefly as in the past, now declared their intent to review police procedures and policies, especially those involving racial discrimination and abuse of power. The investigation extended beyond a single incident to examine and assess how police interacted with communities, particularly people of color and other vulnerable groups. The government recognized that to maintain public trust in the justice system, bold and concrete actions were needed to reform how law enforcement operated. With civil rights organizations continuing to push media campaigns addressing racial discrimination in policing, these efforts quickly spread across major cities, deeply influencing society as a whole. The campaigns aimed not only to expose acts of racial bias, but also to educate the public on how to recognize discrimination and abuse of power within public institutions. These discussions helped citizens better understand their rights and the steps they could take when confronted with police misconduct. Civil rights groups, alongside justice advocates, began using the story of Jasmine and Officer Davis as a powerful tool to drive change within both the legal and social systems. This was no longer just one person's story. It had become a fight shared by all those oppressed and marginalized in society. These campaigns began creating significant shifts in society. Civil rights groups demanded not only reform within the police force, but also change within the judicial system to ensure racial discrimination would no longer be tolerated under any circumstances. These movements raised broad public awareness about the existing flaws in the justice system, particularly within law enforcement. Multiple justice rallies and public discussions about power and racism started attracting widespread participation from people across all backgrounds. They were speaking up, not just for Jasmine, but for a future free from discrimination and abuse of power. Organizations such as Black Lives Matter and the American Civil Liberties Union became leading forces in this movement, with thousands joining protests and media campaigns. Each protest was not only a statement against one officer's misconduct, but a call for comprehensive change in how police interacted with citizens, especially those from minority communities. These organizations continued to advocate for police reform policies, demanding an independent oversight system to ensure misconduct would no longer go unchecked. The discussion on reform extended beyond the streets into classrooms, training programs, and government institutions. After a long silence, the government began reassessing police procedures and policies. They recognized that stopping racial discrimination and abuse within law enforcement required systemic reform, from recruitment and training to behavior monitoring. These measures were not only intended to stop misconduct, but to rebuild public trust in the legal system. Implementing such reforms was seen as a critical step toward building a just society where all citizens, regardless of race or social status, would be treated equally and fairly. The movement against police misconduct and racial discrimination had become an essential part of the broader struggle for justice and human rights. No longer silent, no longer indifferent, communities and social organizations united in building a powerful movement demanding real change within policing and the justice system. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis, once an isolated incident, has now become a global symbol of resistance against racism and abuse of power. Media campaigns continued amplifying the message of reform, helping society understand the responsibility each person carries in shaping a justice system that is fair for all. Following the shocking incident caused by Officer Davis, the community began to witness a clear shift in how law enforcement was perceived. In the past, police were always seen as protectors of justice, as those responsible for public safety. However, Jasmine's story changed that perspective entirely. Police were no longer viewed as figures of absolute authority, but as individuals accountable for their actions. Justice could not be upheld if those tasked with enforcing the law violated the principles of fairness and civil rights. Conversations about racism and power began surfacing more frequently within communities. People no longer accept racial bias within policing or in society at large. Instead, they demanded transparency, change, and reform in the policing system to eliminate misconduct that had often been hidden. These discussions helped the public better understand the root of social issues and laid a solid foundation for confronting persistent flaws within the legal and law enforcement systems. Jasmine's case was no longer seen as an isolated incident, but had become a symbol of social transformation. Communities began reflecting on what had occurred and recognized that the time had come for major structural changes in policing. It was a moment when society had to move toward a more just system, where every citizen would be treated equally, without racial prejudice. This event fostered a growing consensus within the community that police reform was necessary. Organizations, individuals, and civil rights movements started working together to advance that reform. The community was no longer passive, but began to take action. Calls for change were no longer scattered voices, but had evolved into a powerful movement, supported from all directions. Social organizations, civil rights groups, and everyday citizens all became part of this struggle. They demanded that the government and relevant agencies reform law enforcement, ensuring all acts of racism and abuse would be held accountable. Alongside the reform efforts led by civil rights organizations, the strong involvement of young people became a vital force. The younger generation did not remain on the sidelines but emerged as leaders in the social movements demanding change. They were witnesses to repeated injustice and misconduct, and they could no longer accept a broken justice system. This generation felt a strong responsibility to challenge the old guard, those within the police force shaped by racial bias and incapable of delivering fair justice. They called not only for police reform, but also for changes within government institutions and the legal system. These young individuals led protests, organized media campaigns, and pushed forward necessary reforms across society. They understood that change could not come from within the existing structures, but from those with new thinking grounded in equality and justice. The government and relevant authorities began to realize that, in order to stop racial discrimination within policing and the legal system, deep structural reforms were necessary. Protests and public discussions about justice not only highlighted the issue of racism, but also sparked broader debates about how to improve the entire policing system. The government faced increasing demands for serious reform from the public. Initial measures were taken to change how investigations and disciplinary actions were conducted within law enforcement. Although challenges and resistance remained from conservative elements within the system, the government made its first move by reforming police recruitment and training processes, ensuring that officers had a stronger understanding of civil rights and how to enforce the law fairly. In addition, changes in how racial discrimination and abuse within policing were investigated and addressed began to take effect. The government established clear regulations on handling cases involving police misconduct, with oversight from independent organizations. Investigations and disciplinary procedures became more transparent, ensuring that all wrongful actions by officers would be dealt with fairly and without concealment. These reforms helped rebuild public trust in the legal and law enforcement systems, though challenges still lay ahead. However, reform could not be limited to a few technical measures. It needed to be comprehensive, including a shift in police culture and a transformation in how citizens were treated. This shift in public mindset also began to reflect in open discourse and new policies being implemented across society. Discussions about civil rights, power, and racial bias were no longer limited to certain groups, but had become concerns shared by all. Protests and media campaigns not only raised awareness about racism, but also opened a broader dialogue about the need for changes in public institutions. These changes not only improved law enforcement, but also laid a stronger foundation for a just society, where every citizen, regardless of race or ethnicity, would be treated fairly and enjoy equal legal protection. With reform efforts underway, the community started to recognize signs of change. Civil rights organizations continued to expand educational campaigns on racism and justice. Public forums were held not only by advocacy groups but also within schools, educational institutions, and even government agencies. All of these efforts promoted a strong message of equality and justice. Although obstacles still remained, these campaigns marked an important first step in reshaping how society treated its citizens. The official investigation into Officer Davis's conduct began immediately after the videos and Jasmine's testimony were made public. Footage showing Davis drawing his weapon and threatening a woman simply because she was an FBI agent became a central piece of evidence. Investigative authorities could not ignore the case, especially as it had captured significant attention from the public and the media. Every move by officials was closely watched, and each step of the investigation had the potential to reshape how police conduct would be handled going forward. This turned the investigation into a public focal point, where people were not just waiting for a verdict, but watching to see whether justice would be served fairly and transparently. Civil rights organizations and justice advocacy groups immediately increased pressure pressure on authorities. They demanded clear and public results, asserting that Officer Davis's case had to be taken seriously. These groups emphasized that this was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a deeper systemic issue, and that it had to be addressed thoroughly. Timely and fair action would serve as a test of whether the police system truly stood for justice. The public was watching for acknowledgement and action from those in power to ensure that racism and abuse of authority would no longer go unchecked. Public interest in the investigation continued to grow. Media outlets covered every detail, from Jasmine's statements to broader debates on power and accountability within law enforcement. Organizations like Black Lives Matter and the American Civil Liberties Union continued organizing protests and forums, demanding that the government take responsibility for police reform and put an end to racial discrimination. Each update on the investigation was shared and discussed across news sites and online forums, adding to the anticipation for a fair outcome. The pressure from public opinion and civil rights groups was immense, leaving officials no option but to ignore the growing demand. They understood that it was not just Jasmine who was watching, but society as a whole, awaiting meaningful change. As public scrutiny intensified, investigators could no longer operate slowly or opaquely. Their actions now faced constant oversight from the community. Justice advocates refused to allow the case to be forgotten or hidden. The public was not just asking for a conclusion to the investigation, they wanted full transparency throughout the process. Protesters and civil society organizations insisted that any abuse of power within law enforcement be addressed clearly, without tolerance or excuse. They sought justice not only for Jasmine, but for everyone who had experienced or was still facing racial discrimination within public institutions. Public pressure continued to mount on the government and legal authorities. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis was no longer just their personal issue. It had become a symbol of the fight for justice, civil rights, and equality. People wanted to see real reforms within the police system to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. Discussions about reform and the urgent need to change procedures in law enforcement grew more intense. For many, this was a chance to push back against the racism embedded in public institutions, not only in the United States, but in many parts of the world. With increasing pressure from the public, investigators could not afford to delay their conclusions. All eyes were on this investigation, not only to see how Davis would be held accountable, but to determine whether justice could be carried out fairly. Social organizations and activists seized the moment to push for new policies and stress the need for structural police reform. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis had become more than a personal conflict. It was now the fight of all those who had been treated unfairly in society. They believed that only true systemic change in policing could stop racial bias and abuse of power and help build a more just and equal society for everyone. The preliminary findings from the investigation were released after all evidence and testimonies were thoroughly reviewed. Officer Davis, according to the initial report, had clearly demonstrated abuse of power and racial discrimination in the line of duty. The video showing him pulling a gun on an unresisting woman served not only as powerful evidence of misconduct, but also as a strong indictment of his lack of professional responsibility. Investigators concluded that Davis's actions were unjustifiable and completely violated the ethical standards of a police officer. These early findings sparked a wave of outrage in the community, with civil rights organizations and justice advocates demanding strict disciplinary action. Public opinion and social groups quickly called for a formal trial and urged authorities to apply appropriate penalties. Davis's actions had harmed not only Jasmine, but also the public's trust in law enforcement. That could not be allowed to continue without clear consequences, and the call for justice became a central part of the broader conversation around police reform. Facing widespread condemnation from the public and his peers, Officer Davis could no longer justify his actions. His words and behavior now seemed meaningless in the face of undeniable evidence. The community had run out of patience for abuse of authority and racism. Under pressure from social groups and public opinion, Davis had no choice but to face the reality that his actions had crossed all boundaries and could not be undone. He began to understand that the consequences of of his behavior went far beyond the loss of his career. They also included legal and moral accountability. The once arrogant officer now had to confront a painful truth. He had not only failed himself, but had damaged the very police system he once believed to be infallible. The official investigation into Officer Davis's abuse of power and racial discrimination finally concluded. After thoroughly reviewing the evidence, reports, and witness testimonies, the authorities determined that Davis was fully responsible for his actions. The facts of the case were made clear, and there was no doubt about the seriousness of his conduct. In particular, the video footage and the testimony of Jasmine Green served as undeniable evidence that the officer had abused his authority and engaged in severe racial discrimination. The legal system and civil rights organizations could not overlook such a case, and the demand for a fair sentence was made. The government and relevant agencies decided to impose strict disciplinary measures on Davis, not only as a consequence for his misconduct, but also as a strong message to the public about the legal system's commitment to protecting civil rights and justice. Once the final investigation results were released, Officer Davis was brought to trial. The charges against him involved not only abuse of power during duty, but also racial discrimination reflected in both his attitude and behavior. The evidence laid everything bare, leaving no room for excuses. His act of pulling a gun on an unarmed woman simply because she was black and he failed to recognize her as an FBI agent was beyond unacceptable under any circumstance. The court, including experts in law and civil rights, listened to every testimony and examined every detail of the case to deliver a fair and well-grounded verdict. The trial of Davis attracted widespread public attention. Media outlets and civil rights groups continuously covered the proceedings, raising major questions about fairness in the justice system. Public interest extended beyond the verdict itself. It was about the transparency of the entire process. Would justice be truly served? Would this officer face a punishment that matched the gravity of his actions as the community demanded? Public scrutiny was not only aimed at Davis's individual case, but also at the broader issue of how law enforcement and government institutions handle internal misconduct. Could justice prevail when power is in the hands of a few, allowing them to disregard ethical standards? Journalists and civil rights organizations kept the spotlight on the trial, pushing for a clear and fair outcome. Every question raised and every piece of evidence was carefully examined. Groups such as Black Lives Matter and the ACLU joined efforts to amplify demands for reform within the police system. They argued that holding Officer Davis accountable must not be seen as an isolated punishment, but rather as a signal that the justice system and law enforcement must change. This case was not only about one individual's wrongdoing, but about a flawed system that needs to be reformed to prevent future abuses of power and racial discrimination. Davis was no longer the smug officer he once was, but now part of a larger story about the urgent need for reform in the police force and legal system. He faced serious and undeniable charges. Though he might try to defend himself in court, the truth remained, and the clear evidence would not let him escape responsibility. The trial became a major lesson for everyone in law enforcement, that no one can remain silent when abuse of power and racial discrimination occur. For the community, justice had to be served, and this case was the first step in cleaning up the system and building a fair environment for all citizens. As the trial progressed, the public continued to watch closely, not just to see whether the officer would be convicted, but to find out whether broad systemic changes could be made. This story had become a symbol, a powerful reminder of how vital justice is in society, and that power must never be used to oppress others. When the final verdict was announced, society responded with approval and a sense that justice had been served. The conviction of Officer Davis was an important step, but even with the sentence handed down, the problem of racial discrimination in policing could not be solved by a single case. This event was just one piece in a larger picture of long-standing injustice in the police and justice system. However, what the community recognized was that this moment had set a crucial precedent for the rule of law, that no one, whether a police officer or a civilian, could avoid consequences for abuse of power and racism. The conviction was not just a victory for Jasmine, but for justice and equality in society. It proved that the legal system, though flawed and often criticized, could still be corrected and deliver fair decision. Even so, the community understood this was only a small step in the long and difficult journey to address racism within law enforcement. One convicted officer could not erase all the injustice embedded in the system, but it served as a reminder that justice can prevail when people unite and fight. Civil rights organizations and social activists knew this case had to be treated as the beginning of deeper reforms. Only when the root issues of racial discrimination in public institutions are addressed can society truly enter an era of justice and equality for all. After the verdict was announced, social organizations did not stop but continued demanding stronger measures to end racial discrimination across all public institutions, not just the police. Campaigns calling for sweeping reforms in police recruitment and training were launched. Groups like Black Lives Matter, the ACLU, and other civil rights advocates kept pressing the government and authorities for broad changes to prevent future abuse and discrimination. Protests continued, and discussions were held to push for transformation within law enforcement and the public system as a whole. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis became a symbol, a pivotal moment in the fight against racism and abuse of power in society. It was not just about one officer being held accountable, but a social movement demanding a more just legal system, one where every citizen is treated equally, regardless of race or background. The next step in this movement was reforming how police are trained and monitored. Social activists demanded independent oversight mechanisms to ensure no officer could abuse power without facing consequences. Conversations about justice, equality, and reform took place not only in protests, but also in schools, community groups, and international conferences. Jasmine's story, filled with tension and impact, became proof of the community's ongoing fight to ensure that the rights of every citizen are protected and that justice always prevails. Immediately after the incident occurred, investigative agencies, including independent organizations and government bodies, began working to clarify Officer Davis's misconduct. Every detail of the case was carefully reviewed, from the video footage showing the officer drawing his gun to the testimony of Jasmine Green. The video, especially the moment Davis pointed his gun at Jasmine, became a crucial part of the investigation. These images were not only proof of his abuse of power, but also clear evidence of racial bias in his actions. Jasmine Green, in her role as an FBI agent, played a key part in providing accurate information for the investigation while also helping expose racial discrimination within the police force. The public closely followed every move made by investigators, demanding a clear and just outcome. Each step taken by the authorities was under intense public scrutiny. The community, especially civil rights organizations and justice advocates, understood that this investigation was not only about one officer, but about the broader legal and policing systems. Handling the case properly would be a test of whether justice in the system could truly be fair. The social community could not remain silent in the face of abuse of power and racial discrimination in policing. As soon as the incident happened, civil rights organizations like the ACLU and Black Lives Matter spoke out forcefully. They held meetings and public discussions to condemn the officer's actions and push for reform within the police force. These discussions went beyond Davis's conduct and expanded into broader conversations about how police interact with communities, especially minority and Black populations. Advocacy groups called for transparency in the investigation, demanding that authorities make all information public and conduct a fair and impartial review. They refused to let this case be treated as an isolated incident and insisted it must be the starting point for deep reforms in policing practices. What these organizations demanded was a police system free of racial bias, abuse of power, and institutional protection for misconduct like this. The calls for justice for Jasmine and for all victims of racial discrimination were voiced with strength, not just for her individually, but for everyone who has suffered injustice in society. These organizations not only demanded a fair investigation, but also pushed for comprehensive reform within the police force. Protests and media campaigns became essential parts of the fight for justice. Groups like the ACLU and Black Lives Matter, along with justice-minded citizens, continued to press for reform across public institutions. They consistently called on authorities to implement strong measures to stop racial discrimination and abuse of power. Jasmine's story became a symbol, a powerful reminder that such acts of racism and misconduct cannot be allowed to continue within the police, where every citizen should feel safe and protected. Demanding transparency and justice was not just an act of protest, but a call for systemic change in law enforcement and the justice system. Those fighting for justice were ready to continue this battle, not just for Jasmine, but for everyone harmed by racism and abuse in society. The incident between Officer Davis and Jasmine quickly captured public and media attention. Videos of Davis's abuse of power spread rapidly across social media platforms and mainstream news. The image of a police officer drawing a gun on a woman simply because of her race, and then ultimately facing justice, became a vivid symbol in the fight against racism in law enforcement. The call for justice for Jasmine grew beyond an individual plea and turned into a societal demand to confront deeper issues within the policing system. Civil rights supporters, advocacy groups, and individuals spoke out, demanding accountability not just for Davis, but for anyone who abuses their authority. The story of Davis and Jasmine became an emblem, not just of one officer's misconduct, but of the voices of all those marginalized in society. The public was no longer silent, instead driving the demand for reform in the police system, insisting not only on punishment for misconduct, but on sweeping changes in how the system operates. Under enormous public pressure, investigators could not let this case quietly pass. Following the public outcry, they launched a thorough investigation, looking not only into the details of Davis's actions, but into similar behavior that may exist within the police force. This story exposed long-ignored or hidden problems within law enforcement. The investigation went beyond one officer's abuse of power, becoming a broader inquiry into the procedures, training, and structures that might enable such misconduct. Investigators decided the issue could not be addressed solely on an individual level. They had to uncover the systemic factors that allowed abuse and racism to exist within law enforcement. The probe expanded to include similar cases, aiming to identify institutional problems in policing, from recruitment and training to oversight and officer conduct. The public nature of this investigation generated a powerful effect within the community. Public opinion continuously demanded transparency in every step taken by investigators, while social and civil rights organizations persistently pushed for openness throughout the process. It was not only about reaching a verdict on Officer Davis, but also about using the investigation as an opportunity for the police system to examine and expose the factors that fuel racial discrimination within its own ranks. Every action taken in the investigation faced intense scrutiny from the public and media, making it impossible for authorities to ignore or handle the case superficially. Public discussions about police procedures and operations were reignited, prompting society to re-examine long-overlooked issues. The public wanted more than a resolution to this single case. They demanded real changes and reforms in how the police interact with the community. During the investigation, the investigators did not stop at reviewing the incident involving Jasmine, but continued to search for evidence of Officer Davis's past abuses of power. This quickly led to a crucial discovery that this was not the first time Davis had exhibited racially discriminatory and abusive behavior. Videos from witnesses, along with footage from other officers' body cameras in previous encounters, were collected and analyzed. These recordings not only clarified the misconduct in Jasmine's case, but also revealed that Davis had repeatedly abused his authority in the past without facing serious consequences. This evidence made the case even more severe, as it demonstrated a pattern of behavior Davis had followed for a long time. The discovery heightened public concern as people realized that without changes in oversight and disciplinary procedures, such actions could continue, unchecked. The media's attention immediately shifted toward the case, turning Officer Davis's story into headline news. News outlets not only covered the abuse Davis inflicted on Jasmine, but also began digging into the investigation's progress and uncovering similar incidents from the past. Stories about racial discrimination within the police force were no longer treated as isolated events, but as symptoms of a deeper social problem that needed urgent resolution. News programs, from television to digital platforms, continuously analyzed related cases and questioned how such behavior could persist within the legal system and what reforms were necessary to stop racial discrimination in public institutions. These narratives did not just highlight Davis's personal failure, but served as a broader indictment of the entire police system. The media expanded the conversation about how law enforcement must change and what needs to be done to prevent officers like Davis from abusing their power without consequences. The investigation into Davis not only clarified his individual actions, but also propelled a nationwide debate about transparency and accountability within public institutions. Human rights organizations and civil liberties groups began demanding more aggressive reforms in monitoring and addressing misconduct in the police force. These discussions became essential in developing long-term solutions to end racial discrimination in law enforcement, while also protecting citizens' rights during encounters with officers. Public interest in the case continued to rise, pushing the urgency for reform in the legal system and policing procedures, while emphasizing the importance of holding officers accountable in every situation. Immediately after the investigation results were released, the authorities could not delay making a decision on Officer Davis's discipline. Enforcing strict disciplinary action was necessary to ensure justice and restore public confidence in the legal system. Davis was immediately suspended from duty and ordered to appear in court to answer for his action. Investigators clarified that his conduct was not just a personal mistake, but showed clear signs of racial discrimination, and this could not be ignored. The abuse of power he committed against Jasmine was not only violent, but also a reflection of racial bias in his professional conduct. Therefore, the authorities concluded that Davis must face serious consequences, not only to punish him, but also to send a clear message that racial discrimination and abuse of power cannot be tolerated under any circumstances. The suspension was just the first step, but real justice would only be served once he faced a public trial. With disciplinary action in place, public attention turned to the court proceedings against Officer Davis. After a tense and uncompromising investigation, Davis ultimately faced trial. The charges of abuse of power and racial discrimination were presented, and all the evidence, from witness videos to Jasmine's testimony, was stacked against him. His conviction was not only punishment for one individual, but also a sign that society would no longer accept such behavior within law enforcement. This event marked a critical turning point in the fight against racial discrimination in policing, and proved that justice could be served even when the offender held power in society. The community, especially civil rights organizations and justice advocacy groups, closely followed the trial to ensure Officer Davis would not escape accountability. Every move during the proceedings was documented and analyzed, not just by the media but by social activists, to make sure there was no concealment or protection of Davis's misconduct. This case became an integral part of the ongoing struggle to eliminate racial discrimination and abuse of power in police. Davis's conviction and punishment were a victory not just for Jasmine, but for all who have been discriminated against, for those fighting for justice. The community began to witness a revolution in its perception of law enforcement. In the past, police officers were always seen as protectors, people with the authority to maintain order and safeguard citizens. However, after the incident involving Officer Davis and Jasmine, that perception changed. The public no longer saw police solely as enforcers of the law, but began demanding that they be held accountable for their action. This new awareness stemmed from the understanding that power comes with responsibility, and that police, like any public institution, must be subject to strict oversight and regulation to prevent abuse and racial discrimination. people began to emphasize the importance of transparency in public agencies, especially within law enforcement. Jasmine's story was not just a personal incident, but a wake-up call to how power can be abused when justice cannot be served if those enforcing the law are not held accountable for their behavior. This shift wasn't easy, but it started to spread, sparking a wave of demands for transparency, fairness, and accountability at all levels of public authority. Social organizations quickly recognized the opportunity to push for change as society's mindset began to shift. Groups like the ACLU, Black Lives Matter, and civil rights advocates began organizing meetings and campaigns calling for reform in the police force. These groups not only spoke out, but also took action, launching forums, launching media campaigns, and staging protests demanding a more just and transparent policing system. They called for changes in recruitment, training, and oversight of officers to ensure that racial discrimination and abuse of power no longer occurred within the force. The protests became powerful waves pushing reform forward, and community participation grew stronger. Young people, those who had witnessed ongoing injustice, became the driving force in these campaigns. They didn't just protest, they worked to promote education on civil rights, justice, and equality. The community was no longer on the sidelines, but began actively participating in the fight for real change. Discussions about police reform were no longer confined to media platforms, but spread to schools, neighborhoods, and institutions. Social organizations and civil rights groups called not only for changes within the police system, but also for reform across all public agencies. They understood that achieving a just and equal society would require deep, structural changes throughout the legal and governmental systems. These organizations began forming alliances, building a unified movement committed to a more equitable future where every citizen has the right to protection and fair treatment, regardless of race or ethnicity. The protests were not just expressions of opposition, but strong calls for change. Although change was never easy, the community no longer viewed the police system as an untouchable institution. People began to see law enforcement as public servants, tasked with protecting justice and the rights of all citizens, not as individuals with unchecked power who operated without accountability. This marked an important step in rebuilding public trust in the justice system and the police. While the system still had flaws and failures, the community began to see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. A society where justice and equality could become a reality. As the incident between Jasmine and Officer Davis ignited a wave of outrage across society, the community became increasingly aware of the need for police reform. Civil rights organizations, justice advocates, and government officials recognized that for the police to truly serve as an instrument of justice rather than a source of injustice, strong and comprehensive changes were necessary. A growing consensus formed within society, emphasizing that reform was no longer optional but an urgent demand. Meetings and forums were held between government agencies, law enforcement, and civil rights groups with the aim of developing practical and effective reform strategies. Each party presented its perspective and participated in discussions on how to restructure police operations to prevent similar incidents in the future. Issues such as police authority, racial bias, and training protocols were taken seriously. These discussions became the foundation for building a police system that was transparent, fair, and accountable to the public, not just enforcers of the law, but public officials bound to ethical and legal standards. With community consensus taking shape, the first steps toward police reform began. The government started focusing on revising recruitment and training processes to reduce racial bias and prevent abuse of power within the force. Recruitment procedures were adjusted to ensure that candidates with the right attitude and a commitment to fairness were selected, while also making sure they understood civil rights and respected the principles of justice. Training programs were also revamped, emphasizing not only technical skills but also social social awareness, respect for all citizens, and the harmful impact of racial discrimination in policing. The goal was to make officers not just enforcers of the law, but defenders of citizens' rights, regardless of race or ethnicity. The government pledged to carry out deep reforms to ensure fairness and equality for all citizens. These reforms were not only meant to curb abuse and racial bias within the police, but also served as a critical step toward restoring public trust in law enforcement and the justice system. Internal oversight and accountability mechanisms within the police were also restructured to ensure that any misconduct would be identified and addressed promptly. Civil rights organizations and community groups committed to closely monitoring the reform process to guarantee that change would not remain a promise but become real action. Although challenges remained, the progress in reform brought renewed hope that a fair and equitable policing system could become a reality. After the serious incident involving Officer Davis, authorities began to clearly recognize the urgent need for major reform within the police system. One of the first significant changes was the implementation of new training programs for police officers. These programs not only focused on professional skills but also placed special emphasis on ending racial discrimination and abuse of power in police work. Police training institutions were no longer simply teaching officers how to handle legal situations, but also working to instill awareness of civil rights and fairness. These courses required officers to understand the importance of treating all citizens equally, regardless of race, gender, or ethnicity. This was not just a matter of technical proficiency, but also an ethical obligation in the pursuit of justice. Training on racial equality and fair conflict resolution became critical components in ensuring that the police not only protect, but also serve justice without discrimination. These programs were rolled out in all police training centers, which were required to demonstrate that every officer had been fully trained on civil rights and racial equality. Changes in training marked the first but vital step in improving police operations and strengthening the quality of law enforcement. Training was only the beginning. Police departments also implemented wide-ranging changes to their operational procedures. The way officers engaged with citizens, especially in high-stress situations, was revised to ensure there was no abuse of power or racial bias. This aimed to make sure that in all situations, police acted fairly and lawfully, protecting the rights of all citizens without prejudice. Situations in the past where officers acted with excessive force or discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. Police departments began enforcing stricter oversight policies to monitor every officer's conduct while on duty. This included requiring officers to report any actions that could be controversial or raise suspicion about unfair treatment. Departments were expected to maintain transparent monitoring and reporting systems, showing the community that officers were being held accountable for their behavior. This oversight system not only helped detect violations but also laid the groundwork for restoring public trust in law enforcement by ensuring that all misconduct would be addressed seriously. Departments were also required to conduct regular inspections and organize performance evaluations to ensure that every officer acted properly and showed no signs of racial discrimination or abuse of authority. Reforms in operational procedures and training are crucial steps in transforming the policing system. These changes not only help reduce racial discrimination and abuse of power, but also create a cleaner work environment where each officer can confidently act justly and protect citizens' rights fairly. However, reform is not an easy process that can be completed overnight. For it to succeed, these changes require commitment not only from police agencies but from society as a whole. Only when every citizen feels safe and treated equally can justice truly be served and all abuse of power completely eliminated. After the intense controversy surrounding Officer Davis's actions, the community began to see law enforcement through an entirely different lens. Previously, the police were always seen as guardians of social order, but now they face a critical question. How can they control their behavior and treat all citizens fairly? The public is no longer only concerned with whether the police enforce the law correctly, but also with how they treat members of minority groups, especially those who have historically faced racial discrimination. Criminal justice reform is not new, but the public's stake in it later. The police system's repeated incidents of abuse have caused many to lose faith in justice. However, as real reforms began to be implemented and authorities took steps to publicly address misconduct, public trust in the justice system gradually began to recover. The community sees this as a chance to confront long-standing issues within law enforcement and build a more just system. These changes are essential not only to uphold justice, but also to restore citizens' trust in law enforcement. The fight for justice did not end with disciplinary action against Officer Davis, but evolved into a broader social movement. Protests demanding reform and strong community engagement significantly influenced policing policies. The community pushed not only for changes in how police operated, but also for broader reforms across the entire justice system. Large demonstrations demanding rights for racially marginalized citizens brought not just outrage, but also real changes to policing procedures. Slogans like "Justice for Jasmine" were not just calls for justice in a single case, but messages demanding systemic change in public institutions. Organizations like Black Lives Matter and the ACLU not only stood by the victims, but expanded their campaigns, helping the public understand that this fight requires the full engagement of society. The results of these social campaigns became a solid foundation for further reforms across the public sector. This was the first step in building a fair society where every citizen's rights are protected without discrimination. The police force is no longer an untouchable power, but one that must be monitored and reshaped by the very community it serves. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis is not just a story about racial discrimination and abuse of power, but also an important lesson in how to confront injustice in society. What Jasmine went through was not just her personal struggle, but a fight for justice and the rights of all those who are oppressed. From facing racial bias to remaining calm in the face of power abuse, her story sends a powerful message about how to handle unjust situations, not with violence, but with intelligence, resilience, and lawful strength. Jasmine's story is more than a personal event. It has become a source of inspiration for many, especially the younger generation, in the fight for justice and civil rights. The lessons from this story are not only discussed in community meetings, but also taught in schools, where future generations learn the importance of civic power and justice. These lessons go beyond theory. They are about real action, helping people realize that each individual can create change, no matter the circumstance. The actions and decisions of one person can have a wide impact on society, and Jasmine has become the symbol of a broader movement, not just for personal justice, but for fairness across society. Her story has become a beacon in the fight against racial discrimination and abuse of authority, not just within law enforcement, but across all public institutions. Jasmine proved that one person can challenge and change the system if they stand firm for what is right. But communities, especially younger generations, are beginning to see that a better society is built from small acts and are the Ike choices made in everyday moments. The fact that anyone can rise and demand justice, even under difficult circumstances, has sparked a powerful shift across the social landscape. Communities are realizing that change does not come only from policies or government reforms, but also from the mindset and actions of individuals. A fair society, where everyone is treated equally and justice is enforced, cannot exist without each person's participation. Jasmine has become a symbol of this movement, helping people understand that they can play a role in reshaping society. Small acts and right decisions made at crucial moments can have a big impact, influencing how the system works and ensuring that every citizen's rights are protected. The younger generation, especially those who witnessed this story, began to feel a deep responsibility to transform the older generation, those who had failed to uphold fairness and responsibility in serving all citizens. The first steps toward reform had begun, but to build a better society, the most important factor was shaping a mindset of fairness and putting it into action in every individual. Only when society is able to clearly recognize injustice and speak out strongly can justice be fully realized. Jasmine's story made it clear that even a small action from one person could become the driving force behind major change in society. Educational campaigns expanded significantly, not only to raise awareness of justice and civil rights, but also to encourage community participation in social issues and reform. These movements helped the public understand that responsibility does not lie solely in the hands of the government or public institutions, but in every individual in society. They encouraged active engagement in social causes, from participating in protests demanding justice for victims of racial discrimination to joining community organizations pushing for change. People began to understand more clearly their own role and duty in shaping a better society, in helping those in need, and in advocating for the rights of the marginalized. Individuals no longer remained on the sidelines, but became part of the movement, taking part in discussions, contributing ideas in forums, and joining educational campaigns, showed that social change could not happen without unity and participation from all members of the community. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis may have ended, but its message continues to resonate. Change in society comes not only from formal reforms, but also from individuals themselves. This story stands as proof of one woman's courage to fight for justice, a lesson in the power of small actions and the determination of those who stand for what is right. Every step Jasmine took, from facing Officer Davis head-on to remaining calm and composed, reinforced the truth that one person can make a difference. Civil rights groups and advocacy organizations have played and continue to play a crucial role in bringing real change to society. They not only call for reforms in policing, but also envision a fairer and more equal world for everyone. Every action they take, big or small, has a significant impact on the lives of those in the community. People have come to realize they can make a meaningful difference when they unite and act for justice and equality. From protest and advocacy campaigns to public discussions, communities have clearly seen that no change can occur without the participation and effort of every individual. They understand that even the smallest action can contribute to building a more just society. The reforms in policing and the justice system are not merely the result of government decisions, but the outcome of continuous community efforts. This story shows that each person can be part of the change, and that collective power is the key to building a society grounded in fairness and equality. The incident involving Officer Davis was not just an isolated event, but triggered far-reaching consequences, forcing the public to confront critical questions about the police and justice systems. Once the story became public, the community and civil rights organizations persistently voiced their outrage over the injustice, leaving authorities no choice but to respond. The pressure for reform from society became stronger than ever. Official reports revealed that Davis's abuse of power was not merely an individual wrongdoing, but part of a larger system where racial discrimination and misconduct were often hidden and unpunished. The failure to properly address such behavior was not only a reflection of individual irresponsibility, but also a systemic flaw within the legal and law enforcement institutions. Legal authorities quickly released public reports emphasizing that without timely intervention, public trust in the justice system would continue to erode. For vulnerable groups, especially in the absence of clear and decisive action, would further diminish their faith in the system unless significant and visible changes are made by public agencies. The long-term consequences of the incident went beyond punishing the officer, sparking a wave of new awareness within the community about the importance of civil rights and issues of racial discrimination. People began to reassess how police treat citizens, especially those from racially marginalized groups. Discussions around civil rights, equality, and the urgent need for police reform gained momentum. Civil rights organizations, from Black Lives Matter to the ACLU, continued to launch media campaigns to educate citizens on their legal rights. These efforts extended beyond condemning abuse of power, focusing also on educating the public on how to protect their rights when dealing with law enforcement. Steps for handling racial profiling or abuse by police were incorporated into workshops, training programs, and community campaigns, helping individuals understand their rights in society and how to demand justice when necessary. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis opened the door to broader discussions about justice, power, and fairness in society. The police system could no longer operate without close oversight and control from the public. Releasing public reports, hosting open discussions, and launching powerful media campaigns played a vital role in challenging racial discrimination in law enforcement. A shift in public perception about justice and civil rights was an inevitable outcome of this case. It served not just as a lesson for the police, but for society as a whole, reminding everyone that the justice system must protect and respect the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or background. The story of Jasmine and Officer Davis became more than just an incident. It turned into a model lesson in classrooms on justice and power, especially in courses on civics and human rights. From the details of this case, students were taught the importance of civic power and the responsibility of public institutions in protecting justice for all. Human rights classes incorporated real-world lessons, helping younger generations better understand their role in the fight for justice. Jasmine's story was not a standalone event, but a practical example of resilience and the strength of an individual in the battle against racial discrimination and abuse of power. Her story inspired many students to understand that they, too, could create meaningful change if they stood up for what is right. At the same time, police training programs across the country began undergoing major changes after the incident. Police academies recognized that acts of racial discrimination and abuse of power within law enforcement could no longer be ignored. Courses on racial awareness, systemic bias, and the role of authority in society were added to training curricula. New recruits were not only taught about procedures, legal codes, and tactical skills, but also about the importance of treating all citizens fairly, regardless of race or ethnicity. These reforms aimed to reduce racial bias and build a police force that respects and protects civil rights. This shift was expected to gradually dismantle long-held prejudices in law enforcement, creating a fairer work environment where every citizen is treated with respect, no matter their background. Jasmine became a symbol of a strong woman who faced adversity without resorting to violence. Her story clearly showed that one person can make a difference in society. Even in an extremely tense and dangerous situation, she remained calm and relied solely on her legal authority and inner strength to prevail. Her image, a woman of color, unafraid in the face of a powerful officer, became a symbol of courage and determination. Her story encouraged every citizen, no matter who they are, to stand up for their rights in any situation. Jasmine proved that meaningful change in society does not need to come from violence or overwhelming force, but from actions that are right, smart, and unwavering. Jasmine's story pushed the community to understand justice as a form of power. Justice is not just an abstract concept, but a force every citizen can wield to fight for their rights. Her decision to stand up to the officer was not just a personal act, but a symbol of change, a reminder to everyone of their responsibility in defending justice. It also carried the message that justice does not always come through loud protests. It can come through quiet resilience and a firm belief in one's rights. The story of Jasmine Green and Officer Davis moved far beyond a single legal case, gradually becoming a wave of change in social awareness. What stood out was not that a police officer was convicted, but how the community began to reconsider the structure of power in everyday life. Until then, in the minds of most people, the police represented absolute authority, commands that were not to be questioned, enforcement that citizens had no choice but to obey. But after that incident, when a black woman calmly faced a gun barrel and showed her FBI badge instead of fear, it felt like a slap to that outdated perception. The community began to understand that the law does not reside in the hands of the armed, but in the knowledge and courage of every citizen who knows how to defend their legal rights. The change was not loud, not declared, but happened quietly within each person. Old questions were replaced by new affirmations. Police are not supreme. They are public servants and therefore must be accountable to the public. In community meetings, public discussions, and even high school classrooms, Jasmine's story kept being repeated. People began teaching children that if a police officer oversteps their authority, citizens have the right to resist through legal means, through evidence, and through collective voices. Civil rights organizations, which had operated quietly for years, now felt a renewed energy. They launched widespread campaigns about civil rights, printed flyers on how to handle unreasonable police stops, organized small training sessions in each neighborhood, and invited lawyers to explain and simulate real-life scenarios. On social media, edited videos of the incident became educational content, shared millions of times as tools to inspire awareness. Many people, for the first time in their lives, dared to say, "I don't have to stay silent anymore." The awakening did not stop with those who had been hurt by the system. It spread to people who had stood on the sidelines, those who once believed the issue had nothing to do with them. They began to see that an abuse of power against someone else today could be an abuse against them tomorrow. Empathy grew from a specific case. In city halls, public inquiries no longer focused solely on water supply or road repairs, but began to include questions about internal oversight of the police force. People were no longer afraid to engage in dialogue. They demanded transparency, demanded statistics, and demanded that officials be held responsible when those under their command acted wrongly. Once a society starts making demands, that is when the balance of power begins to shift. Awareness campaigns now carry real weight instead of symbolic meaning. On public walls, the slogan, "Know Your Rights," is painted in bright red, with short instructions below on how to record video, preserve evidence, and contact lawyers and legal aid organizations. Schools, which used to avoid the topic of police and justice for fear of controversy, now proactively invite social activists to talk with students about human rights and the right to live without having a gun pointed at your face just because of your skin color. Adults are relearning from scratch, while children grow up in an environment where justice is no longer an abstract ideal, but something that must exist, must be protected, and must be fought for to survive. Each individual began to recognize their role within the larger structure of the community. Speaking out was no longer seen as opposing the government, but as a moral responsibility. People started paying attention to the city council, to local elections, learning more about who would lead the police department, about the budget for police training, about oversight and accountability system. Things once thought to concern only journalists or scholars became part of everyday awareness for ordinary citizens. They knew the names of politicians, understood the function of each public office, knew when to submit a petition, when to raise their voice, and how to make sure they would not be ignored. The greatest shift, perhaps, did not happen within the government, but in the heart of the community. They no longer waited for someone else to come and save them. They equipped themselves with knowledge, courage, and steady determination. More importantly, they learned that change begins by not turning away from injustice. The incident between Jasmine and Officer Davis created a crack in the old trust, but from that very crack, light began to enter. A society that knows how to question itself, how to improve itself, and how not to forgive injustice is a society that is growing. And in that journey toward growth, each citizen began to become a part of justice. Under the wide-reaching influence of the Jasmine Green and Officer Davis case, the younger generation was no longer on the sidelines. They began to feel, more clearly than ever, that fairness was not a privilege for a select few, but a universal right that every individual deserved to have protected. Lessons that had once been taught vaguely in civics classes were now brought to life through real situations, real images, and real stories unfolding in their own society. In classrooms, teachers no longer avoided sensitive topics like racism, power, and justice. Instead, they encouraged students to discuss, challenge, analyze, and form personal viewpoints. The classroom became an open space where critical thinking could thrive, a place where students could ask directly, "If I were in that situation, what would I do? If I were a witness, would I have the courage to speak up?" Young people began learning to look at reality with clarity and courage. They understood that to change society, one cannot sit still and hope someone else will act. The lessons from Jasmine's story became a powerful source of inspiration for a generation in the process of forming their identity and values. From high schools to universities, from student clubs to close-knit friend groups, the awareness of fighting for justice was being nurtured day by day. They shared articles, created videos, and launched media campaigns on social platforms aimed at spreading knowledge about civil rights and legal ways to protect oneself. The movement led by young people did not stop at social media posts or written calls to action. Student groups organized outdoor forums and invited human rights experts to speak. They were not afraid to take to the streets, hold signs, chant slogans, and more importantly, they acted with discipline and a clear purpose. Protests became increasingly common in major cities, organized, led, and supported by long-term strategies. Each sign carried short but firm statements. Justice has no color. Silence is complicity. Learn to resist. Understand to stand strong. Universities became centers of political awareness, where young people not only studied academic knowledge, but also learned how to live responsibly, how to face injustice, and how to resist it without hesitation. These student groups did not work in isolation, but built connections with civil rights organizations, legal institutions, and even progressive politicians. They sent petitions, created demand lists, organized voter outreach sessions, and did not hesitate to speak publicly to express their views. To them, Jasmine's case was a reminder that even 1 second of silence could let justice slip away, that the apathy of the majority gives space for abuse to grow. Jasmine's story was no longer just one person's story. It became a call to an entire generation. In community gatherings, young people took on roles as facilitators and motivators. They taught children how to recognize their individual rights, organized role-playing exercises so people would know how to respond in cases of police misconduct. One notable trait is that this generation did not act out of emotion, but based their actions on reason, data, and legality. They did not aim to oppose the government, but demanded transparency, fairness, and accountability from public officials. This generation learned how to document evidence, how to ask the right questions, and how to use social media to create constructive pressure on the system. In the campaigns they led, there was no name-calling, only statistics, legal citations, and references to similar cases. They understood that in order to change the rules, they had to first learn them, master them, and use them to force the system to operate justly. The momentum from young people created upward pressure that lawmakers could not ignore. Student voices were present in hearings, speaking before local legislatures with confidence and precise logic, not letting emotions blur their goals. Policy committees began including youth proposals in their agendas. Some states added subjects on justice, civil rights, and community dialogue into school curricula, using Jasmine's case as a real-world illustration of the rule of law principles. Teachers began to realize that legal education should not be reserved for law students alone, but must become a foundation for every citizen growing up in a civilized society. From what once seemed like a clash between two individuals, the movement, led by young people, shook the entire system. Marches with thousands of young people, hand in hand, chanting messages of justice in the heart of cities, became proof that the next generation would not accept injustice, would not compromise with abuse of power. They reignited hope for those who had felt lost in society, and they, through resilient action and steady intellect, are gradually building a new kind of justice, stronger, more inclusive, and more humane. Under intense pressure from public opinion and the widespread social movements following the case of Jasmine Green, government agencies were forced to shift. Police reform policies, long delayed across multiple administrations, were now accelerated at an unprecedented pace. Emergency interagency meetings were convened, attended by community representatives, legal experts, and civil rights organizations. A range of priority issues was targeted for reform, focusing on 3 core pillars: recruitment processes, training programs, and systems for monitoring police behavior. In recruitment, new psychological and social assessments were introduced to screen out candidates with problematic views on race and authority. Exams were no longer limited to physical ability or technical knowledge, but now included evaluations of emotional control, nonviolent communication skills, and the ability to handle situations with humanity. The Department of the Interior issued new guidelines requiring state-level police departments to meet minimum standards in racial sensitivity training, the history of discrimination in law enforcement, and public service ethics. Training programs for new officers were also thoroughly restructured. Instructors were no longer limited to tactical trainers, but now included sociologists, psychologists, and community members who had been victims of abuse of power. Real-life stories, such as the incident between Jasmine and Davis, were incorporated into the curriculum as case studies to help young officers understand the consequences of reckless actions and of reacting from bias instead of reason. Training courses were required to include scenario-based practice sessions where officers learned de-escalation, negotiation, and coordination instead of instinctive violence. At the same time, internal oversight systems were upgraded with technology cameras, and behavioral analysis software began to be rolled out nationwide. Officers were required to report any interactions with citizens that involved tension, and those data were stored in independent review systems to ensure transparency. The federal government did not stop at policy statements. It backed them with budget commitments. A reform package worth hundreds of millions of dollars was allocated to localities with high rates of police complaints, along with periodic compliance assessments. Each year, police departments would be required to publish public reports detailing incidents with signs of racial bias, how they were handled internally, and what measures were taken to prevent recurrence. Departments with consistently high complaint rates would face cuts to training budgets or be required to replace leadership if no meaningful progress was shown. In congressional hearings, government officials emphasized that Jasmine's case was a wake-up call and that reform was no longer optional. It was a moral obligation for the entire system. The shift in policy did not stop at words or documents, but began to materialize through concrete changes in how the police interacted with the community. Community police task forces were established, involving residents, youth, and civil organizations to build a bridge between public authorities and the people. Regular meetings between police and residents were held in open spaces to encourage two-way dialogue and remove the fear and tension that had long defined these interactions. In areas once marked by racial conflict, tensions began to ease as law enforcement came to understand that power was no longer a weapon but a responsibility. Officers learned to listen instead of command, to empathize instead of impose. Those who had previously been investigated for misconduct were required to undergo retraining or resign if they refused to adapt. What stood out was the high level of public support for the transformation. People did not merely observe, they actively participated in oversight and proposed solutions. Civil rights groups acted as an external brain to the system, constantly offering critique, corrections, and pressure to ensure reform pledges were not just symbolic. New policies were passed without the fierce resistance of previous years, because for the first time in a long while, the community sensed sincerity in the change. They saw that the reports were no longer sterile documents, but carried real effort by the system to prevent anyone else from going through what Jasmine had endured. Jasmine's story did not just mark a media milestone. It became a catalyst that pushed the justice apparatus to reflect on itself. Davis symbolized an outdated model, while Jasmine stood for a future where the law serves all people, regardless of race or class. Because of her resilience, the community made its first breakthrough in reshaping the police force, not one driven by prejudice, but by the rule of law and the ethics of public service. Reform was underway, and while it remained a difficult path, it stood as proof of the power of a story, an individual, and a community that refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. In the wake of the widespread reform movement sparked by Jasmine Green's case, police behavior monitoring programs became a top priority. From major cities to small counties, a standardized reporting system was rolled out nationwide. Every officer, from recruits to high-ranking officials, was required to submit regular reports detailing their interactions with citizens, especially during ID checks, pursuits, or use of force. No situation was considered an exception. Every action had to be documented, accessible for review or internal investigation at any time. These reports were not just forwarded to superiors, but also submitted to independent oversight boards that included civil rights advocates, community lawyers, and randomly selected local residents. The independent oversight system became a major turning point in the reform process. In the past, misconduct investigations were typically handled behind closed doors within the department, but now every police unit is subject to evaluation by a civilian board independent of the law enforcement system. This board had access to body camera footage, past conduct records, and citizen complaints. If there were signs of concealment, the police agency would have its internal oversight function suspended during the investigation. Every report and every small action, from the way a question was asked to the tone used in giving orders, was examined and fed into an AI behavioral analysis system designed to detect patterns of potential abuse or discrimination. As a result, incidents like the one involving Davis began to decrease because every officer now understood that they were being watched not just by supervisors but by an entire community tracking their every move. Alongside oversight came sweeping reforms and training. Police training centers were required to overhaul nearly their entire curriculum, no longer focused primarily on technical maneuvers or tactical suppression. The new training programs prioritized human and social dimensions. Recruits studied the history of civil rights movements, the complexities of relationships between law enforcement and minority communities, and concepts like unconscious racial bias, something many had long believed did not exist within policing. A mandatory part of the curriculum involved community discussions, especially with those who had been victims of police violence, to help recruits learn to listen and understand emotions from the other side. Cadets were required to undergo psychological evaluations that measured emotional responses when provoked or placed under power stress. More importantly, the training programs emphasized nonviolent skills such as negotiation, empathy, and stress management. Scenario simulations no longer revolved around takedowns or rapid threat response, but focused on de-escalation, understanding the mental state of civilians, and resolving situations through communication. A good officer was no longer defined by their shooting accuracy, but by their ability to protect justice without harming anyone. Instructors included human rights lawyers, sociologists, and even former inmates, offering a multi-dimensional perspective. Stories like Jasmine's were no longer condensed examples on a slide. They became vivid lessons, rich with responsibility and warning. Within the force, commanders were also required to undergo advanced training in ethical leadership and internal conduct oversight. Heads of police units could no longer overlook or ignore misconduct by subordinates. Any citizen complaint had to trigger a response process within 48 hours, with documented records and reports submitted to higher authorities. Delays or falsified records would result in the commander's dismissal or even prosecution for covering up systemic violations. Senior officers were required to publicly share their unit's reform plans, hold quarterly meetings with residents, and answer community questions directly. This not only created a more transparent policing system, but also gradually restored trust among those who had once been deeply harmed. Thanks to the combination of strict oversight and training reform, a new spirit began to move through police departments nationwide. Stories of officers helping civilians, apologizing when wrong, and protecting citizen rights began to appear more frequently in the media. From being at the center of criticism, some police departments became models for transforming public service culture. Jasmine, though not physically present in training sessions, had her story featured in nearly every class as a symbol and a warning that power, if misused, becomes a double-edged sword. It was her quiet, unshaken resolve that day that triggered a system-wide shift, and with reform gradually spreading, society is moving closer to a future where justice is no longer a distant concept, but a reality people can believe in. Under the spotlight of national attention, the story between Jasmine Green and Officer Davis moved beyond the bounds of a single incident, becoming a symbol of a profound societal lesson. From university lecture halls to high school classrooms, from policy seminar stages to police training sessions, Jasmine's name was cited as a prime example of unwavering resolve and the power of civil rights in the face of abuse. The lessons drawn were not only about appropriate behavior under pressure, but also about how one woman could transform injustice into a beacon for sweeping reform. The story was included in justice education curricula, used by civil organizations in awareness campaigns, and presented as a reminder that justice is not a gift to be granted, but a value to be fought for and upheld. Younger generations, raised in the age of social media and instant access to information, received the story with a different mindset. They did not listen passively. They turned outrage into action. Forums on social justice were held on school campuses, where students raised questions, debated, and proposed public policy improvements. High school students began conducting research projects on racial discrimination in their own communities, and some schools created Justice Day, where students engaged in social scenario stimulations. Many NGOs partnered with schools to host regular workshops, inviting real people with real experiences to speak about power, harm, and resistance through reason. Local communities were not left out of the shift. People who once stayed silent in the face of abuse began participating in public forums, sharing personal experiences while applying pressure on local governments to change policies. City councils were compelled to hold more public hearings, where civil rights groups openly demanded police reform, judicial overhaul, and greater administrative transparency. Protests were no longer scattered actions, but became organized events drawing hundreds or even thousands of people from all walks of life, including former officers, teachers, nurses, and students. Marches now carried banners with messages beyond justice for Jasmine, including handwritten signs reading, "No system above justice, accountability is power," and "Silence fuels abuse." Reform efforts were no longer confined to policing. They began to reach the entire public sector. Administrative agencies were pushed to disclose complaint handling procedures. Health departments were urged to combat racial bias in patient care, and government hiring offices were required to commit to transparency in their evaluation processes. Jasmine's story became a landmark reminder that justice does not exist in a vacuum. It must be protected by every small unit of a much larger system. The punishment of a single officer does not change everything, but it is an essential starting point in a long process that demands reflection from every other institution. Public conversations about civil rights, racial bias, and government accountability gradually became a normal part of social life. On television, in podcasts, and at community forums, people discussed the right to live safely when your skin is not white, the right to question law enforcement when they are wrong, and most importantly, the right to be heard without being dismissed. Media outlets also changed how they reported, moving beyond simply narrating events to embedding analysis of the historical, cultural, and systemic contexts that created such injustices. From a corner of a park where a woman had a gun pointed at her face because of her skin color, society began clearing the way for meaningful change. Jasmine's story became proof that one individual could ignite a collective wave, that calm is not weakness, but the highest form of strength in the face of anger. And most importantly, it served as a reminder that justice only truly exists when it is built from the ground up, from those who have been forgotten, insulted, and still choose to rise and walk toward the light. Human rights organizations and civil groups, after generating significant pressure through the story of Jasmine Green, did not stop at demanding individual accountability. They pushed for deeper reform across the entire legal and public administration systems. They petitioned the government to establish independent oversight boards to ensure abuses of power by law enforcement would not be hidden or forgotten. Groups of lawyers, activists, and scholars began working together to draft new legislation, define clear standards for police behavior, and provide citizens with more effective reporting mechanisms. Public civic conferences where people could speak up and suggest reforms became more common, reflecting a powerful resurgence of grassroots democracy sparked by what once seemed like an isolated but deeply impactful event. Meanwhile, communities across society expanded the fight for a more equal and humane world. In neighborhoods that had long ignored systemic failures, residents began organizing discussions and community education sessions around civil rights, how to identify abuse of power, and how to respond legally in situations like Jasmine's. Youth groups went door to door handing out flyers, talking to families about the right to be respected and how to document incidents when feeling threatened by authority. Documentary screenings and social media campaigns moved beyond simply sharing outrage and shifted toward offering clear, actionable guidance. They developed anonymous reporting apps and ran training sessions for young citizens on how to monitor local government. Through that persistent effort, they sent a clear message: justice cannot be a privilege, it must be a fundamental right. The civil rights movement no longer focused solely on policing, but had spread into the darker corners of society where injustice had long taken root quietly. Voices began to rise from homeless shelters, slums, undocumented immigrant communities, and religious minorities. From stories that had been buried, people became living proof that the system was cracked in more than one place. Campaigns for the rights of women, people with disabilities, and the poor were rebuilt with a renewed spirit of solidarity and a common mission to fight entrenched inequality. Jasmine's story was no longer an ending. It became the push that made all those who had been marginalized feel they, too, could speak, and they, too, would be heard. Not long after, the movement's influence spread beyond the borders of the United States. International civil society organizations from Europe to Africa and South America began using Jasmine's case as an example in human rights conferences. Hashtags like Justice Beyond Borders and Global Civil Power began appearing on global forums. Movements from Brazil to South Africa started learning from how Americans had turned a moment of injustice into a chain of policy reforms. Jasmine was invited to speak at global civil rights events, not as a victim, but as a living testimony to the power of change when one person stands firm in dignity and principle under the most dangerous circumstances. She rarely spoke of pain or anger, instead focusing on turning harm into action and singing that action to inspire. Amid this global ripple effect, one truth became clearer than ever. Injustice is not a local issue. Discrimination, abuse of power, and silence in the face of another's suffering, these are universal. And because of that, solutions cannot come from just one place. Every community, every nation must learn how to rise, how to self-correct, how to raise a generation that dares to question, dares to say no, and dares to pursue truth to its end. Jasmine's story, with its strength and timely silence, reminded the world that change does not begin with loud declarations, but with a quiet refusal to tolerate what is wrong, even for a second. And it is that refusal, once it spreads, that clears the path for the next steady, unflinching steps toward a more humane society. Davis was ultimately faced with a harsh sentence from the court, not only as punishment for his abuse of power, but also as a warning to those who continue to disregard the dignity and lives of others. His justifications were completely rejected, backed by clear evidence and the close scrutiny of the media, the public, and human rights organizations. When the verdict was announced, there was no cheering or noise, only a moment of stillness in the courtroom, where everyone understood that what was right had finally prevailed. Jasmine sat quietly in the gallery, her expression showing neither anger nor satisfaction, but a deep calm, the calm of someone who knew she did not wait for justice, but helped bring it into being. That story did not end with a verdict or a personal ruling. It became a new chapter in the history of social movements, where a black woman chose not to confront with violence or dramatic words, but with sharp CLM and unwavering faith in the legal system she served. Jasmine never needed to declare that she was right, because everything that unfolded spoke louder than any statement. Her actions forced society to reevaluate how it treats those who are dismissed, doubted, or pushed aside because of their skin color, gender, or sexuality. Alongside the sentencing of Davis, reforms began to show real effects. Complaint response procedures were simplified, community oversight of the police was strengthened, and police training programs were required to integrate racial equity content. Several states implemented mandatory audio recording of all interactions between police and civilians, increasing transparency and reducing the chance of abuse. Areas once silent began hosting forums where police were expected to sit and listen rather than command. The once tense relationship slowly began to mend through honest, regular dialogue, driven by the understanding that justice cannot be delivered by those afraid of being questioned. The future of society did not arrive by default. It was built through small, steady changes. When children grow up hearing Jasmine's story, they do not just hear about a woman who kept her composure with a gun in her face. They learn to recognize injustice and how to respond to it with reason. They are taught not to fear the police, but to understand that the law serves justice, and justice belongs not to the powerful, but to truth and perseverance. Civil rights education was integrated into school curricula, and community gatherings included lessons on civic rights, turning legal knowledge into a common tool in every citizen's hands. Jasmine's image was no longer that of a lone figure in a headline-grabbing incident, but a quiet symbol of those who choose dignity in the face of violence, who stand tall amid contempt, and who wait patiently for justice to speak. From her, a new generation learned that silence, when used with purpose, can echo louder than 1,000 protests. You do not have to shout to reveal the truth. You only have to walk steadily through every moment of confrontation, never yielding to what is wrong, even if your heart trembles. That is the kind of strength this society needs, and that is what Jasmine's story has left behind. When cities began publishing transparent data on cases of abuse, when police officers knocked on doors to apologize for past harm, when those who once stayed silent became spokespeople for justice, society slowly began to heal, not through loud slogans, but through steady, deliberate actions carried out with persistence, anchored by Jasmine's story as a reference point. It was no longer a fight against an individual, but a journey to rebuild trust, correct systemic wrongs, and restore justice to where it rightfully belongs, at the heart of the people. And when that story came to an end, no one spoke of Davis as a person, but as a symbol of a system that collapsed under its own arrogance and negligence. Nor did anyone celebrate Jasmine with loud praise, but by quietly following the path she had once opened, they taught their children to be brave and kind, reminded one another to meet each other's eyes without judgment. They began every conversation with a question, not a command. That was the true victory of justice, not in the verdict delivered, but in the hearts of a community that had been permanently changed. This story closed not with drama or spectacle, but with a deep and lasting shift in public consciousness. Jasmine was not the first to face abuse of power by the police, but she became one of the rare figures who turned that moment of tension into something far greater than herself. By not retreating, not compromising, and not using any weapon other than the law and her reason, she left behind a profound lesson for an entire generation, that real power does not lie in a gun or a badge, but in understanding, self-control, and the ability to use calm as the sharpest weapon. Davis represented an outdated form of power, one built on fear, prejudice, and pride. Jasmine, by maintaining her composure to the very end, showed what true power looks like in a civilized society. She did not need to shout or strike first, because truth and the law stood with her. Her decision to remain silent when necessary, to act at the right time, and to let justice speak on her behalf made people reconsider how we confront injustice. And the calm she maintained throughout was not indifference or avoidance, but the quietest, most resilient form of resistance, something no police officer could suppress with force or status. The greatest lesson from the story is not just the sentence handed to Davis, but the understanding that every citizen has the power to change society if they rise at the right moment. Jasmine did not act to become a symbol. She acted because she understood her role in a system teetering from the imbalance between power and ethics. She did not demand justice, she moved in a way that made justice appear. With clarity in every glance, every word, and every decision, Jasmine turned what could have been yet another familiar tragedy into a lever for reform. She did not do it for recognition. She did it because she believed that if no one speaks up, silence becomes complicity. The final message this story leaves behind is not a slogan, but a serious reminder. A just society is not only a dream, but something that can be achieved if each of us acts together for justice. The world does not change because of a single verdict, but because of millions of small decisions made every day, from standing with the oppressed to refusing to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing, whether in a conversation or in a courthouse hallway. Jasmine did not choose the easy path, and because of that, she opened a new door for millions to walk through, a place where they believe justice is not distant, but something that can be claimed through kindness and resolve. From that story, classrooms began to explore the concept of power more deeply. No longer just a rigid definition in textbooks, it became a vivid lesson drawn from a woman who made an entire system reflect on itself. Civics programs now cite Jasmine's example as a way to inspire, to spark awareness that anyone can create change if they stay true to what is right. In conferences and forums, from local communities to global stages, people no longer speak only about policy reform, they speak about Jasmine as a clear example of change from within. The ending of this story is not marked by the moment Davis was sentenced, but by the place where people who once felt small and powerless now begin to believe they have a voice, where police officers understand they do not stand above the law, but serve it, where calm is no longer mistaken for weakness, but recognized as the highest form of courage, and where a Black woman can step out of her car, raise her badge, and shift the perception of an entire nation. Jasmine needed no medals or praise. She stepped out of the center of the debate the same way she entered it, quiet, deliberate, and fully in control. But her presence will remain in the memory of society as a reminder that every time we choose calm in the face of injustice, every time we refuse to bow to what is wrong, we move justice one step forward. And like Jasmine, we do not need to become heroes. We only need to stand for what is right, even if we stand alone. Because from one person, change began. And what seemed like an ordinary morning in the hallway of a courthouse where legal disputes regularly unfolded in tension, Jasmine Green, a veteran FBI agent, was stopped and questioned by Officer Davis, whose eyes were filled with suspicion. The incident quickly escalated from a simple stop request into a series of blatant abuses of power and racial bias. Davis, with a condescending gaze and a commanding tone, assumed that Jasmine, a Black woman, could not possibly hold any role other than that of a suspect. She did not react violently, nor did she protest with harsh words or aggressive gestures. Jasmine chose to remain silent, to observe, and to wait for the right moment to expose the true nature of the man attempting to assert dominance over her. Officer Davis not only drew his gun, but also mocked the FBI credentials Jasmine presented, and it was only when her glinting badge was raised that he realized the worst mistake of his career had begun. With prejudice and pride, Jasmine's ability to remain calm not only helped protect herself but also unintentionally sparked a social shockwave. The video capturing Officer Davis drawing his gun on a Black woman, only to have the situation flipped by her powerful identity and composure, spread at lightning speed. The online community was outraged not only by the officer's actions, but because they saw in Jasmine's eyes a strength that so many had lost when faced with injustice. Protests erupted. Civil rights organizations spoke out, and a full investigation into abuse of power within the police force was launched. Davis was no longer seen as just an individual. He became a symbol of unchecked authority, while Jasmine became a model for citizens who know how to wield the law as a rightful weapon to protect themselves and inspire an entire society. The investigation quickly widened, and evidence from body cameras, witnesses, and Davis's past conduct revealed this was not the first time he had crossed legal boundaries. A wave of new training and oversight programs was issued across law enforcement, while lessons on justice, civil rights, and power regulation were introduced into the education system. Reforms in recruitment, routine evaluation, and independent supervision made clear that this incident would not end with a single trial, but marked a real shift in institutional thinking. Student groups, young activists, and minority communities launched media campaigns and held open discussions on racism in schools, public spaces, and even in the halls of Congress. Jasmine never claimed to be a hero. She was simply a citizen who did the right thing at the right time. But it was precisely her humility and steady presence that made her a quietly spreading flame. In that light, people saw clearly the difference between false power rooted in force and real power rooted in justice, integrity, and understanding. She did not need to win an argument or force her opponent into submission through fear. She made everyone fall silent with the truth. And from there, a society long accustomed to injustice began to shift. The lesson this story leaves behind is not about how to win a trial or handle the police. The real lesson is how not to lose your dignity in the worst circumstances, how to stay rational when being disrespected, and how to turn a moment of injustice into the foundation of a social movement. Jasmine showed that to change society, we do not need to change the whole world. One right action by one right person at one right moment can move everything. And in the end, this story did not close with a verdict, but with millions of questions rising in society's conscience. How do we train a police force that understands power correctly? How do we ensure every citizen believes they can be heard? How do we raise children to know that skin color does not define dignity? These questions cannot be answered in a single day, but thanks to Jasmine, they have begun to be asked, and that is the first step toward any real change.